Hello everyone, my name is Stefan Dorondel. I'm an anthropologist and environmental historian based at the Francisc Institute of Anthropology in Bucharest, which is part of the Romanian Academy, and I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Southeast European Studies in Bucharest. I thank the RCC for offering me the possibility to present my newest research project. As the director of the project, I hope that your questions, comments, suggestions will help me and the other 5 members of the team to improve all the coordinates of the project. The team, like the project, is quite interdisciplinary. We are 3 anthropologists, 1 historian, and 2 geographers. And today I'm going to talk about river islands as webs of life. Islands are vital elements for rivers' ecosystems, as they fulfill important hydromorphological and ecological functions. Islands contribute to water purification and sediment and nutrient retention. They provide important habitats for birds, animals, and insects, and are vital for fish reproduction and feeding. They support a wide variety of endemic species of vegetation and animals. While natural scientists exhibit a great interest for fluvial islands, social scientists and humanities scholars have rather neglected this topic. This is probably because the vast majority of islands are not large enough to be permanently inhabited and therefore play a marginal role for local riparian communities. River islands are, as Lahiri Dutti and Samantha put it, of a nomadic nature. They tend to appear and disappear, to move upstream and downstream according to river dynamics. And here you can see on the slides how islands move across the rivers. So we have 2 neighboring villages. Then the silt accumulates in the channel that separates the 2 islands, which is with the brown color. Then the vegetation starts to grow on the accumulation of silt, and then the 2 islands merge. Finally, we have 1 single island. Moreover, newly emerged islands on rivers that constitute borders between 2 states remain a no man's land until they are incorporated into state territory. Despite their apparent social vacuity, investigating islands from a social science perspective can bring important contributions to the understanding of local ecologies, made of complex interactions between riparian communities and river islands ecosystems. Historically, fluvial islands were used by riparian communities for agriculture, grazing, wood gathering, and fishing. The emergence and movement of fluvial islands also affects the positioning of state borders and therefore have political repercussions. Yet, fluvial islands have been invisible to classical historians and anthropologists. With this research, we render them the visibility they merit and explore how they have always been part of human history. The project aims specifically at investigating the role played by the lower Danube islands in modern and contemporary histories of riparian communities within 3 neighboring states, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine. You see here on the slide what I showed you before, the movement of islands. There is an example here close to Belene, Bulgaria. Most probably these 2 islands will become in future 1. And here you see a lavish vegetation of the Danubian island, an example from Costinu, Romania. And the 3 riparian countries we will be working in, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine, obviously they share the Danube as border. The research focuses on a period of almost 200 years, from 1830s, when the Danubian islands appeared for the first time as a major issue in setting the border between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire, until nowadays, when a new fluvial island ruined an EU investment in the newly built port of Rust, Romania. Therefore, the research aims at a longue durée analysis of the Danubian islands to explain how these amphibian landscapes are socialized and appropriated by riparian communities economically, ecologically, and culturally. We also investigate how islands are involved in socio-political conflicts and their impact on riparian states' political relationships. Because fluvial islands are bound up in human affairs, we contend that the hydromorphological dynamics of islands will illustrate the entangled history of the three riparian countries. This perspective, which attempts to reveal the entangled history of ecosystems and human societies, is still marginal in Southeast European historiography and social anthropology. While rivers have received much attention in environmental history, fluvial islands are less investigated. There are two main directions of research concerning fluvial islands. First, the geomorphology perspective, which sees the emergence of islands as a consequence of ineluctable natural processes of human interventions, including erosion and the movement of sediments, which interfere with river flow and floodplains. Pico et al. Defined the river islands as an area of, I quote, woodland vegetation surrounded by either water-filled channels or exposed gravel on site, which exhibits a certain degree of stability and remains above water even during floods. Islands can appear when wood debris or even human artifacts get stuck in a gravel bar. This causes sediments to accumulate, which enables vegetation to grow and the islands to form. In a paper published in Environment and History in 2019, we present the case of an island which formed in the second part of the 19th century around the wreck of an Ottoman transport boat. The images displayed on the PowerPoint graphically depicts this process. So we have a wreck, then the silt accumulates around the wreck, then the vegetation starts to grow on the silt, and finally a new island emerges. The emergence of an island influences the two channels that flank it. The channels narrow, deepen, and influence the angle of flow towards the bank. There are thus hydrological and morphological entanglements between the bank, the island, the river's flow quantity and force, and the vegetation growing on the island. And, as our case studies will demonstrate, such entanglements have deep political and economic consequences for riparian people and states. A second direction of research looks at islands as sites of juridical and geopolitical conflict, especially the islands of rivers that separate nations. The modernist project of river transformation, for economic reasons, for transportation, for harnessing energy, etc., complicate the status of rivers as borders. In order to negotiate the borders, natural scientists were summoned to define more precisely different forms of sedimentation, such as river deposits, sandbanks, or islands. The transformation of rivers through technology, damming, building levees, dredging, modifies the flow of water charged with sediments, as well as the balance between erosion and deposition processes and fluvial forms. These heavy human interventions along a river do not foreclose the possibility of islands emerging. They only make this phenomenon more unpredictable. While acknowledging the importance of such studies, our research engages a different theoretical perspective. We engage a more than human or multi-species approach in order to show that humans, land, rivers, plants, and animals are entangled with each other. As Alfred Crosby puts it, if we want to understand humans, we need to consider them as biological entities that coexist with other organisms. With roots in the theoretical works of Donna Haraway, Michel Calon, and Bruno Latour, this approach gives equal importance to humans and non-humans in explaining social realities. Multi-species environmental history is not only about how human societies affect and change natural environments, but also about how social realities are shaped in interaction with non-human and non-living entities and processes, such as soil transformations and river hydrodynamics. As archaeologist Jan Hodder notes, humans and non-humans, plants, animals, soil, rivers, have always been in relationship of codependency. What we add to this theory is the long historical perspective, which has often been missing in modern human approaches. We address this issue by looking at the entangled history of humans and non-humans for a period of almost 200 years. Another shortcoming of previous multi-species work is the lack of attention given to social inequalities and power relations in the analysis of socio-ecological assemblages. A historical and ethnographic approach will show how the development of capitalist relations and nation-states affected the relationship between riparian communities and island ecosystems. Finally, highlighting the ways in which human and non-human destinies depend upon and determine each other, to cite Anna Tsing, is essential for understanding the roots of the climate crisis. A more than human perspective will help us trouble the anthropocentric historiography of Eastern Europe and thus better problematize the Anthropocene. We posit that looking from this theoretical perspective at the fluvial islands of the lower Danube may offer a fresh approach in environmental history and environmental anthropology, particularly regarding Romania and other Southeast European countries where these research directions have barely developed. One of the usual critiques brought to environmental history is that whereas natural environments are borderless, researchers are bounded in their inquiry by national and linguistic borders. Our research transcends this thorny issue by engaging comparison between the three riparian states. The main objective of the project is to show how the movement of Danubian islands is entangled with riparian states and local communities in Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine between 1830s and 2020, and how these entanglements co-produce politics, economics, and episodic events. In order to achieve this main objective, the project is organized around three sub-objectives. The first sub-objective is to assess the relationship between the islands movement and the establishment of the borders between the three states along the Danube, and how this affected riparian communities and economic rights. When a river constitutes the border between two countries, the border is established on the Talveg, or the deepest point of that river. Established in the 19th century, this international convention requires riparian states to draw an imaginary line along the river's bed that corresponds to the deepest level of the water, and that serves as a navigational path. This is the Talveg. However, when the islands are moving, the Talveg moves too, which complicates the policing of the border and the fishing policy of the neighboring states. Since early 1990s, Bilateral joint commissions of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs discussed the border on the Danube between the three riparian countries. However, since 1990, the joint commissions for establishing the border have rarely met. Consequently, newly emerged islands along the lower Danube are a no man's land and fiercely disputed borderlands. The emergence of nation-states after 1878 and the emergence of capitalist society also changed the riparian community's relationship with the islands. The nation-states policed the border more thoroughly than the Ottoman Empire had done before 1878, and they stymied free access to islands' natural resources, encouraging the capitalist exploitation of these resources. In order to meet this objective, we will access the National Historical Archives, which hold the documents of these commissions, and interview current members of the commissions in all three countries. We will use the Geographical Information System, GIS, in which Marina Virgilianu, who is a member of our team, is a specialist, in order to document and map the border's diachronic and synchronic movement, the emergence and merging of the stateless islands, and the way they co-produce geopolitical negotiations and tensions between riparian states and local communities. The second sub-objective is to evaluate the economic entanglements of island movements with the riparian communities and riparian states between 1900 and 2020. In order to study the economic entanglements, we will have three case studies. The first case study concerns the history of the only inhabited island on the lower Danube, which was flooded in 1970 by the Romanian socialist regime in order to build the Iron Gates hydropower plant. And you have here an image of that island that disappeared in 1970 and an image in the interior of the island with the Turkish population. The population was displaced before the islands was sunk. In order to accomplish this task, we will search the national and local archives and carry out interviews with former inhabitants here about the island. The second case study concerns the abandoning of the European Union-funded port of Rust, Romania, due to the sudden emergence of an island in front of the port. The port was designed to harbor barges to unload grains for export and thus serve the development of this region, which counts mostly on agricultural production. As the island was not dredged at the beginning of its formation, it has now completely changed the access to the port, rendering it a useless investment. The newly built infrastructure is now falling into ruin, and you have here images of what had to be a port and the abandoned infrastructure, and also too much enjoy of the kids in the region. They swim where it had to be a serious infrastructure. Finally, the third case study will investigate riverbank erosion that affect the local beaches. As I explained before, the movement of islands influences the erosion of the banks. Danube beaches represent a major source of revenue for riparian communities, especially those beaches found in villages which are close to the cities. Many rural shops depend on the affluence of urbanites who visit the beaches in summer. You have here one example of such a beach near Slanotran, Bulgaria. In one of the villages where we carried out fieldwork, the mayor's office built with European funds a small resort of wooden huts for those tourists who want to stay longer in the village. The disappearance of the beach and the urbanites who visited turned the resort into a ghost. We investigate this case and other similar cases by ethnographic fieldwork in villages from Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. Besides ethnography, We will use GIS to diachronically analyze the erosion of the riverbanks and the disappearance of beaches. You have an example here of eroded beach next to an island, in Košava, Bulgaria. The third sub-objective is to document and analyze the economic and episodic entanglements between the wild boar that dwell on stateless Danubian islands and riparian communities along the neighboring banks between 2010 and 2020. The island-dwelling wild boars reach the banks overnight and destroy the crops and gardens of riparian communities in all three countries. The wild boar is also considered by locals and by veterinarians as a carrier of the N1H1 virus. In the last 10 years, the three countries experienced several episodic outbreaks which caused severe economic damage to the rural population, as the authority ordered the extermination of all swine in these regions. We will carry out interviews with both farmers and with bureaucrats and veterinary experts from the local branches of the Ministry of Agriculture and Health Population departments of the three countries. Additionally, remote sensing data will be used for a spatial temporal change detection analysis in order to illustrate the economic and episodic effects on riparian communities' crops. Concerning this issue, we will also look at newspaper stories and farmers' complaints to Parliament in all three countries. As for methodology, this research engages a multidisciplinary approach. We will engage historical research in the local, national, and institutional archives in the three countries. We look for documents that describe the movement of islands, historical maps which are available from 1850 onwards, and documents that describe the use of islands by riparian populations. We also engage ethnography in our investigation, that is, ethnography carried out in multiple sites, in villages, in offices of health experts and other authorities, in the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs offices. Our ethnographic fieldwork will respond to various aspects of our three objectives through interviews with farmers, fishermen, villagers, government commission members, regional authorities, and Department of Public Health experts. We will also engage geographical analysis, that is cartographic heritage, geospatial data, and remote sensing imagery in order to perform a complex spatial temporal investigation on the movement of islands. The diachronic approach has been successfully used to study river channel and islands dynamics by Ioana Toroimac, a member of the research team. Multispectral satellite imagery together with orthophotos from national databases will allow us to derive the spatial features, including the land use and land cover information of the islands for the last decades. Moreover, the remote sensing data will be used to detect and map the spatial temporal changes and the economic and episodic effects on riparian communities. Finally, we will do media analysis of regional and national newspapers' reports about the attacks of wild boars and about the public discourse on boars as carriers of N1H1 pathogen. Finally, you can see here the members of our team. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.